You might be thinking, how could someone like Thomas, who appeared so polished and professional, flip a plate over at a family gathering? Well, it was shocking for me too. As I stood there, amidst the scattered pieces of food and the hushed murmurs of our relatives, I couldn't help but wonder how it all came to this. The day began ordinarily enough. I remember waking up early, excited to host our first large family gathering since our wedding. I planned to cook Thomas's favorite dishes, as well as some new recipes I thought would impress the extended family. Cooking isn't really my forte, but I wanted to make an effort to show that I cared about my new role as a wife, even though deep down, I missed my job terribly. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed indifferent from the morning. He barely touched his breakfast and seemed lost in thought, probably about work. He always had a lot on his mind, being a consultant at a major firm. I tried to engage him, asking about his preferences for the table setting or the food, but he just nodded absent-mindedly. Hours later, as everyone gathered around the table, laden with dishes I had spent all day preparing, the atmosphere was initially warm. Laughter and conversation filled the room. It was just as I had hoped. But then, Thomas took that one bite, and his demeanor shifted drastically. His face contorted with dissatisfaction, and without warning, he flipped the plate. The room fell silent. "Why would you serve this on such an occasion?" Thomas's words cut through the silence like a knife. Everyone stared, some in disbelief, others in discomfort. As he continued ranting, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. This wasn't just about the food, it was about me not meeting his expectations, not just today, but every day since I had left my job. The job I loved, the job I was good at, which I had left to fulfill his wish of having a stay-at-home wife. It wasn't me. I finally spoke up, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt inside. "I didn't cook today." I watched as his face went from angry to confused. Yes, I had planned to cook, but at the last minute, I had to order in because I received a call from a former colleague needing urgent help with a project, a reminder of the life I had before. Now, with everyone's eyes on me, I realized this was my moment. I needed to stand up for myself, to reclaim some part of the identity I had before Thomas. I had always been more than just his support system or someone to manage his home. I was a professional, a friend, and someone with dreams and aspirations. Taking a deep breath, I looked around at our relatives, then back at Thomas. "I'm not just your wife," I said, my voice clear and confident. "I am Sarah Mitchell, and I have my own worth beyond this household." In that moment, I didn't just stand up for myself. I took the first step toward finding a balance between the life I once loved and the one I was learning to navigate. Have more control over our lives. This realization struck me profoundly as the days turned into weeks and then months. Living the life of a weekend wife, I found myself looking forward to the brief weekends when Thomas would be home, but even those days weren't as joyful as I imagined they would be. Each Friday, I would feel a mix of anticipation and anxiety. I would clean the house meticulously, cook his favorite dishes, and try to create a welcoming environment, hoping to capture some semblance of the life we had promised each other. But the reality was often different. Thomas would arrive home, tired and preoccupied, barely acknowledging the efforts I had put in to make everything perfect. Our conversations were superficial, mostly revolving around his work or trivial matters. It was as if we were slowly turning into strangers living parallel lives under the same roof. This arrangement made me question the essence of our marriage. Was it just convenience for him? A place to return to when he needed rest or a break from his bustling professional life? It seemed that his commitment to his job was his priority, and our marriage, a secondary arrangement that needed to fit around his career. It dawned on me that in his view, my role was to support this structure, silently, without complaint. As I mulled over these thoughts, a part of me felt deeply lonely. The house felt too big, too empty, and the silence too loud. I missed the companionship, the shared daily experiences that I believed marriage would bring. I missed discussing my day with someone who cared, cooking together, and even arguing over small, inconsequential things. These everyday interactions, which I once thought mundane, now seemed like a luxury. I began to fill my days with activities to distract myself from this loneliness. I joined a local community center, started attending cooking classes, and even considered part-time consultancy work in my old field. Each new activity brought a small sense of fulfillment and a break from the echoing quiet of the house. One weekend, when Thomas came home, he noticed the change. He saw the new plants lining the windowsill, the art supplies in the corner of the living room, and the stack of consultancy papers on the dining table. "What's all this?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his tone. "I've been keeping busy," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Exploring old interests and discovering new ones." He looked around, seemingly trying to reconcile with the changes in the home and, subtly, in me. I could tell he was surprised, maybe even a bit unsettled, that I was finding ways to be happy without him. "Looks like you've been enjoying yourself," he said, trying to sound supportive, but I could detect a trace of discomfort. "Yes, I have," I admitted, realizing in that moment how true those words were. This self-discovery, born out of necessity, was unintentionally becoming my way out of the shadows of our weekend-only marriage. As I stood there, watching his reaction, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for me, one where I could perhaps find a balance between the love I had for Thomas and the love I was rediscovering for myself. Hearing her voice was unexpected, almost jarring against the backdrop of the silent, near-empty house. She sounded concerned, her words tinged with urgency. "Sarah, I've been trying to reach Thomas for days now. He's not answering my calls or texts. Is everything okay between you two?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Oh, we're managing," I replied carefully, my voice neutral. "Thomas has been very busy with work, and he's not often home. Maybe he missed your messages." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her processing my words. "I see," she finally said, her tone shifting slightly. "But that's just it, Sarah. His office called me. They said he hasn't been in for a week. They're worried." A knot formed in my stomach. Thomas hadn't been home much, but I assumed his absences were due to his work. The thought that he might be lying about his whereabouts added a new layer of anxiety and confusion to the mix. Why would he disappear from his job without telling anyone? "Thank you for letting me know," I managed to say, my mind racing. "I'll try to find out what's going on and get back to you." After we hung up, 1,000 thoughts whirled through my head. Where could Thomas be? Was he okay? Was there another reason for his absence? The uncertainty was maddening. I decided to call his closest friend, hoping for some insight. The friend seemed surprised to hear from me, but was equally in the dark about Thomas's whereabouts. Feeling more alone than ever, I realized I needed to take action. I couldn't keep waiting for Thomas to provide stability and honesty. It was time to seek answers on my own. I started by visiting his office. The receptionist recognized me, and her face fell when I asked about Thomas. "He hasn't been here in a while," she confirmed, her voice low. "We thought he was on a long business trip." The pieces weren't adding up. There was no business trip that I knew of, and his sudden disappearance from work was alarming. I thanked her and walked out, my mind numb. What was Thomas hiding? Was our entire relationship built on deceit? I felt betrayed, not just by the potential lies, but by my own willingness to turn a blind eye to the signs that something was wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, I went back to our home and began digging deeper. I checked bank statements, emails, anything that might give me a clue to his whereabouts or activities. With each discovery, the picture grew increasingly troubling. Large sums of money transferred to unknown accounts, strange names and numbers, and hotel bookings in cities Thomas had no reason to visit. It was as if I was married to a stranger. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, I sat surrounded by papers and digital trails, a sense of dread settling over me. My marriage, it seemed, was a facade, and the man I thought I knew was a mystery. This wasn't just about a weekend marriage anymore. It was about discovering who Thomas really was and deciding how I would navigate a future that was suddenly as unclear as the motives of the man I married. Feeling a mixture of rejection and resolve, I hung up the phone, the harsh tone of my mother-in-law's voice still ringing in my ears. The conversation had not gone as I hoped. I had wanted some understanding, perhaps even an ally in navigating my crumbling marriage, but instead, I faced skepticism and accusation. It stung, realizing that even with the best intentions, I was still viewed as the outsider, the one at fault. Alone in the quiet of our house, the walls seemed to close in on me. The echoes of Thomas's lies reverberated through the empty rooms. It was clear that he had painted a picture of our marriage to his mother that was completely detached from reality. A part of me wondered how long he could maintain this facade, and what would happen when it finally crumbled. With Christmas approaching, I knew the family gathering would be an opportunity to see Thomas, perhaps even confront him in person about his actions and the divide between his words and reality. It would also be a chance to observe the dynamics of his family more closely, to understand why his mother held such unwavering support for her son, despite evidence to the contrary. As the days passed, my resolve strengthened. I decided to gather evidence of Thomas's comings and goings, or rather, his absences. I installed a small security camera that covered the front door and kept a detailed log of the days and times he was actually home. It wasn't something I took any pleasure in, it felt more like a necessity, a way to protect myself from further accusations and to perhaps someday show his family the truth. I also reached out to a few friends who knew both Thomas and me. I needed support, someone to talk to who might understand or at least listen without judgment. Their reactions were mixed, some were shocked, others not so much, having perhaps seen signs of Thomas's behavior that I had missed. As Christmas drew near, I prepared myself mentally for the family gathering. I knew it would not be easy. The air would likely be filled with festive cheer on the surface, but beneath, tensions would simmer, especially between me and Thomas's mother. I packed the camera footage on a USB drive, tucked securely in my purse, not sure if I would use it but feeling empowered by its mere presence. The drive to my in-laws' house was a quiet one, filled with apprehension and a sense of inevitability. Upon arriving, I was greeted with superficial warmth. Thomas was there, his demeanor cool and composed as if our strained phone calls and his prolonged absences were just figments of my imagination. Throughout the evening, I watched and waited, looking for the right moment to perhaps bridge the gap with my mother-in-law or confront Thomas. But as the night wore on, with laughter and the clinking of glasses around me, I felt more like an observer than a participant in this family scene. At that moment, it became clear that the challenge ahead was not just about proving my truth, but deciding how I would navigate this complicated web of relationships and my own path forward. Whether Thomas or his family ever came to see my side, I knew I needed to find a way to live authentically, not just in their eyes, but in my own. As the silence stretched taut after Thomas's outburst, the room filled with uneasy glances and murmured whispers among the relatives. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but inside, my resolve hardened. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment to put my plan into action, albeit in a way that maintained dignity amidst chaos. Turning to Thomas, I kept my voice calm, despite the storm raging within me. "I didn't make the dish, Thomas," I stated clearly, ensuring every relative could hear. The room fell even quieter, the tension almost palpable. Thomas, caught off guard, blinked in confusion. His mother, who had been quick to criticize me in the past, looked from me to Thomas, trying to gauge the situation. The housemaid, who had been in the background, paused in her work, her eyes behind her glasses watching the drama unfold. I had spoken with her earlier, one of the few alliances I had formed in preparation for today. She knew the truth of the situation, having actually prepared the dish herself under my instruction to ensure everything went perfectly for the gathering. Thomas's uncle, who had always seemed indifferent, now showed a flicker of interest, his eyes sharp. "Thomas, if Sarah didn't cook, then why blame her?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. It was a simple question, yet it shifted the dynamic, drawing attention to Thomas's unreasonable behavior. My mother-in-law, now visibly conflicted, glanced between her son and me. "Thomas, you should apologize. It's Christmas, and no way to treat anyone," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it directed towards me. It seemed the public nature of Thomas's humiliation of me had tipped the scales, even if slightly. Thomas, red-faced and flustered, mumbled something unintelligible under his breath, not quite an apology but a retreat from his earlier aggression. I could see in his eyes a flicker of the realization that he had overstepped, that his usual tactics hadn't worked with an audience. Seizing the opportunity, I addressed the room, my voice steady but warm. "Let's not let this spoil our Christmas. I'm sure everyone put a lot of effort into being here together, and it's supposed to be a day of joy and forgiveness." As I spoke, I met the eyes of each family member, including the quiet housemaid, whose slight nod gave me a sliver of encouragement. My father-in-law put down his newspaper, his gaze meeting mine for a fleeting moment with what I hoped was a spark of understanding or perhaps approval. From that point, the dinner resumed with a strained but improved atmosphere. Conversations tentatively restarted, focusing on lighter topics, the usual holiday banter. I participated where necessary, but my thoughts were already ahead, planning my next steps after this revelation. Though today had been about proving a point, about showing that I was not the person Thomas or his mother portrayed me to be, it was also a turning point for me personally. I had stood up for myself publicly, and whatever the outcome, I knew this was just the beginning of a larger change I needed to make in my life, with or without Thomas. This Christmas might have started with conflict, but it ended with a sense of empowerment, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope about my future. As the truth unfolded before the gathered relatives, a sense of disbelief seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. My mother, who had been masquerading as the housekeeper, now stood revealed in her true identity, her expression a mix of determination and apprehension. Thomas, usually so quick with his retorts, now stood silent, his face drained of color. The realization of his deception, of the web of lies he had spun, seemed to weigh heavily on him. His eyes flickered nervously between me, my mother, and the other guests, as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. My parents-in-law, who had been so quick to defend Thomas in the past, now stared at him with a mixture of shock and disappointment. The realization that their son had been lying to them, manipulating the truth to suit his own agenda, must have been a bitter pill to swallow. For me, standing there amidst the unfolding drama, there was a strange sense of liberation. I had spent so long feeling trapped in Thomas's web of deceit, questioning my own worth and validity in the face of his accusations. Now, with the truth laid bare for all to see, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. "I think it's time we had a frank discussion," I said, my voice steady despite the roiling emotions inside me. "Thomas, you've been deceiving not just me, but your own family as well. It's time to come clean and face the consequences of your actions." Thomas opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His facade of confidence seemed to crumble before my eyes, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. My mother-in-law, her eyes shining with unshed tears, reached out to me, her expression softened by understanding. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. We had no idea." "I had no idea," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude for her acknowledgement. It wasn't the resolution I had expected, but it was a start, a recognition that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than living a lie. As the evening wore on, conversations shifted, tensions eased, and slowly, a sense of normalcy returned to the gathering. But beneath the surface, I knew that everything had changed. The facade of Thomas's perfect marriage had been shattered, revealing the cracks beneath. In the days and weeks that followed, there would be difficult conversations, painful truths, and perhaps even more revelations. But for now, in this moment of clarity and honesty, I allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that I had finally taken a stand for myself and the life I deserved. As the murmurs in the room grew into a storm of disbelief, I stood with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around me. My voice cut through the clamor as I continued, "I suppose this might come as a surprise to you, Thomas, as well as to everyone else here." I swept my gaze over the shocked faces of his relatives. They clutched their pearls and adjusted their glasses, trying to process the unfolding drama. "I've endured much since we declared our vows, vows that seem only to bind me and not you, Thomas. Each weekend, when you graced our home with your presence, I lived a partial marriage, a shadow of what I had hoped for. My tone was even, but the weight of my words hung heavily in the air. It was in these long weekday silences, in the stretches of solitude, that I realized something had to change. I turned slightly towards Mary, who still seemed puzzled by the reality crashing down around her. Mary, I don't blame you. This is not about you or me. This is about a man who has failed both of us, weaving webs of deceit that have ensnared more than just his wife. I could feel Thomas's stare, burning with a mixture of anger and fear, but I held my ground. As you can see, Thomas, I said, turning back to face him squarely, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And today, it seems, the truth wants to be heard. His mother, previously so vociferous in her defense, was now silent, her face a mask of consternation and denial. I can't believe my Thomas would do such things, she whispered to the relative beside her, but the conviction was gone from her voice. The room felt charged, a brewing storm of revelation that threatened to sweep through the house and cleanse it of the pretenses under which it had long operated. Thomas attempted to speak, his voice a blend of desperation and incredulity. This is some mistake, I can explain everything, he stuttered, his eyes darting around, seeking an ally in a sea of skeptics. But before he could construct his defense, another voice chimed in, Uncle John, always the peacemaker, yet his tone now carried an edge of disappointment. Thomas, we've seen enough. We've heard enough. It's time you own up to your actions and face the consequences like a man. The family's eyes turned towards Thomas, waiting for his response, for his confession, for any sign of remorse. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, it became painfully clear that Thomas was still scrambling for an escape route from the truth laid bare. The tension was palpable, a living entity in the room, as we all waited for what would come next. As the weight of the detective's report sank in, silence descended upon the room, broken only by the soft rustling of papers as I displayed each damning document. Thomas and Mary's expressions mirrored each other, a mixture of disbelief and horror. The evidence was irrefutable, detailing dates, places, and intimate conversations between them that stretched back years. As I flipped through the photos and messages, each piece felt like a betrayal, yet there was a strange relief in laying it all bare. Thomas, his voice a mere whisper, tried to interject. This isn't what it looks like. It's not. Enough, Thomas, I cut him off sharply. We're beyond excuses now. The truth is here, in black and white. I gestured to the stack of papers. Your late nights, the weekends away, your so-called business trips. It's all here. The relatives, previously buzzing with whispers and murmurs, now watched in stunned silence. Their eyes darted between Thomas, the papers, and me, as if trying to reconcile the man they knew with the evidence of his deceit. My father-in-law, a stern man who had always been distant but respectful, finally spoke. His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth I had occasionally seen during family gatherings. Thomas, you've not only deceived your wife, but you've disgraced our family. We raised you better than this. My mother-in-law, whose defense of Thomas had been unwavering, now seemed smaller, her energy diminished by the weight of her son's actions. Her eyes, once fiery with indignation, now brimmed with tears of betrayal. She looked from the evidence to me, and then to her son, the realization dawning on her that her fierce maternal instinct had blinded her to the flaws in her own child. Mary, the young woman caught in the middle of this storm, seemed lost. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a dawning understanding of the situation. She glanced at Thomas with a look that was part betrayal, part dawning horror, as she realized the extent of the lies he had woven around both of us. I continued, my voice steady, but not unkind. I wanted a marriage based on trust and partnership. What you chose, Thomas, was a facade, a weekend routine that allowed you to live a double life. I couldn't let this continue once I knew. Not just for my sake, but for honesty's sake. As the gravity of the situation settled over the room, Thomas stood frozen, his usual eloquence gone. His attempts to maintain a facade of innocence were futile in the face of overwhelming proof. The family, once so vibrant and lively during our gatherings, now looked at him with a mix of disappointment and anger. It was clear that things would never be the same. The revelation of Thomas's infidelity and the calculated deception had shattered not just our marriage, but the family's perception of him. As the reality of his double life was laid bare, everyone in the room had to confront the fact that the person they thought they knew was far different from the truth. Following the chaotic revelation and Thomas's hasty exit, the atmosphere in the room was heavy with the aftermath of scandal. Relatives stood or sat in stunned silence, processing the drama that had unfolded. My mother-in-law, her voice, barely audible amidst the quiet murmurs, finally broke the silence, her words tinged with regret and disbelief. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." I looked at her, feeling a mix of vindication and sadness. "It's okay," I replied softly, understanding that the deception was as much a shock to her as the confrontation was necessary for me. "I know this isn't easy for anyone." My eyes swept the room, catching glimpses of pity, shock, and even some whispered support among Thomas's relatives. It was clear that the image of the happy couple they had been fed was shattered. The truth, as ugly as it was, had liberated me from a facade that had become too painful to maintain. Taking a deep breath, I addressed the room. "Thank you all for being here today. I'm sorry for the scene, but it was something that couldn't be left in the shadows any longer." My voice, steady now, carried a quiet strength. "I believe it's best if I leave now." There were nods around the room, some murmured apologies for having doubted me, and expressions of support that hadn't been there when I first walked in. My mother, who had been by my side disguised as one of the maids, gave me a small, encouraging smile as we prepared to leave. We exited the house, leaving behind the tangled web of lies and deception. In the days that followed, I filed for divorce. It was a strange feeling, filling out those papers. Despite the short duration of our marriage, the ordeal felt like it had lasted a lifetime. The apartment we had shared was no longer a home but a reminder of the deception. Fortunately, the transition was smoother than I had anticipated. Thomas had left without a fight, overwhelmed by his own deceit and the consequences that followed. As I settled back into single life, the sense of relief was palpable. The divorce label seemed inconsequential compared to the freedom I regained. My return to the workforce was a breath of fresh air. I rejoined the condominium management company where I had worked before, and the familiar routine, the daily challenges, were invigorating. Working again, interacting with colleagues and clients, I felt a part of the world once more, a stark contrast to the isolation of my married life. It affirmed my resolve: if I were to ever consider marriage again, it would have to be under different terms, with a partner who respected and valued my independence as much as their own. Meanwhile, Thomas's situation had become precarious. His financial recklessness with Mary, coupled with the fallout from our public confrontation, left him in dire straits. Without support from his relatives, who were disillusioned and unwilling to aid him further, he had resorted to taking out a bank loan. The prospects of their planned marriage seemed bleak, with both sets of parents advocating for financial stability before any wedding bells could ring. Sitting in my renewed singlehood, the troubles of Thomas seemed distant, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. The contrast between my newfound contentment at work and his ongoing struggles was stark. I found peace in my daily life, content with the work I did, and the relationships I nurtured, freed from the shadows of deceit that had once loomed